Welcome, everybody. Did you know that brain diseases are now the world's leading source of disability? One of the most debilitating is Parkinson's disease, is the fastest growing neurological disorder in the world. Over the past 25 years, the numbers of people with the condition has jumped from 3 million to over 6 million. And by 2040, it has been predicted that it will literally double again. So in addition to impacting millions of lives and livelihoods, Parkinson's is poised to crush our healthcare system and also our economy. This, while harmful pesticides and other toxic chemicals that are known to contribute to Parkinson's, they surround us every day, disproportionately affecting our farmers, our veterans, and even those in Silicon Valley and so many others. So today we're talking about a really important topic, and with a co-author of the book, Ending Parkinson's Disease, with Dr. Ray Dorsey. Dr. Ray Dorsey, he likes to go by, is the David M. Levy Professor of Neurology at the University of Rochester, just up the road from me, from Buffalo, New York. And for the past decade, he has used telemedicine to improve care for individuals with Parkinson's disease. His research has been published in leading neurology, medical, and economic journals, and has been featured on NPR and in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Previously, he directed the Parkinson's disease division at St. Johns Hopkins Medicine and consulted for McKinsey and Company. Welcome, Ray.
Thanks very much for having me, T, and thanks for giving a voice to these important issues.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to be talking here with you today because, of course, I have my book right here, which I've been reading, and very interesting, all the information in there. And I'd like to know, how did this book come about? We know a little bit about your background, but 4 of you got together to write this book. The story behind it, I'm sure, is fascinating.
Yes, so I started reading a book called How to Survive a Plague by David France, and it talked about another infectious disease that emerged that was unknown in the 1980s, was uniformly and rapidly fatal, and there was an absence of a coordinated federal response. That virus was HIV. And the setting of that epidemic, at least, a group of activists adopted a motto called silence equals death. And for them, silence equals death. And they formed an organization called ACT UP, and they were politely disrupted everything that they could. And they barricaded the streets of New York. They took over the New York Stock Exchange. They took over the FDA. They took over I think the pharmaceutical company, and they changed the course of the disease. And they changed the course of the disease not only for themselves. When in 1996, we developed a new class of drugs called protease inhibitors that led to HIV having a near normal life expectancy, but they changed the course for millions of us, including potentially you and me, T, or our friends or our family members who don't have HIV because of their efforts. And they found ways to prevent the disease, through the widespread use of condoms. And the beauty of their work is that we don't know who the beneficiaries are, and we don't even give them any credit. We should, but we don't, or few of us do. And when I was reading that, I was like, we need to do the exact same thing for Parkinson's disease. As you indicated, Parkinson's is now the world's fastest growing brain disease, even faster than Alzheimer's. Today, 200 Americans will be diagnosed with the disease, and another 100 will die from the disease. And there's been an absence of a coordinated effort or a groundswell of activism to change the course of the disease. So my colleagues and I, many of us were at a meeting celebrating the 200th anniversary of the major description of the disease by Dr. Parkinson. And we came up with this idea about writing an article on the Parkinson pandemic, and that resonated well. So we said, why don't we write a book on the same topic? And that's how we got to where we are.
I love it. It's such a great thing. You all 4 came together, and I consider myself an activist. So, I will be promoting what you all have done as well. So in the book, you refer to Parkinson's as a pandemic, and I found that very interesting, and how chemicals have fueled the onslaught of it. Can you explain that a little bit further for the audience?
Yeah, so when Dr. Parkinson first described the condition in 1817, it was likely a really rare disease. He was 61 years old, been practicing medicine for 30 years. His father was a physician. He knew a lot of medicine. And he said, I'm describing a condition that's not been classified in the medical literature. And he really described a condition that he observed in 6 people walking the streets of London with a stooped posture, a shuffling gait, and shaking hands. And he said, I don't think, and he said, he called this a disease of shaking palsy. He didn't have the arrogance to name it after himself. That other neurologist named it after him about 50 years later. But I don't think it's a coincidence that he describes the condition in 1817 in London, which was the height of the Industrial Revolution, and London's the capital. As many of you know, anyone who's watched the show The Crown, the London fog had little to do with weather and everything to do with air pollution. And since that time, numerous products and byproducts of the Industrial Revolution, including air pollution, certain pesticides, and industrial chemicals have all been linked to the disease. Areas of the world that are most industrialized have the highest rates of the disease, like the United States and Canada. Areas of the world that are least industrialized, like sub-Saharan Africa, have the lowest rates of the disease. And areas of the world that are undergoing the most rapid industrialization, like China and India, have the fastest increasing rates of the disease.
Very interesting. I think people don't understand the history of the chemicals, and bringing the Industrial Revolution in there, and for people to understand the increase in chemicals in our society, in the products we've used. It's so apparent to me because I guess because I grew up in a household that we didn't use much. My mother was very in tune to all the things that were out there on the market that she did not want in our homes. I mean, we use coconut oil on our skin and on our face, and she tried to keep us away from as many chemicals as possible, even though everything was so marketed towards us as teenage girls and boys. So for people to understand, that's where it began, was really the Industrial Revolution, the onslaught of all these chemicals and the correlation. So between the increase of these chemicals and the increase in brain diseases, and do you see that? I mean, I'm sure you report on that, and it seems so obvious to me that, and not only just brain diseases, but also so many other illnesses that have just accelerated throughout the years of all these chemicals that we're putting in our bodies and around our bodies.
Yeah, it's not just Parkinson's disease. Just to give some easy examples, everything from acne to lung cancer are all been fueled by changes in our environment, changes in our diet. Lung cancer in 1900 in the United States almost didn't exist. There were almost no deaths due to lung cancer in the United States in the 1900s. It wasn't until the advent of cigarettes that we saw a rise in lung cancer. About 25 years after people started smoking, we started seeing a rise in lung cancer, a disease that was considered a once-in-a-lifetime oddity by doctors at the turn of the 20th century. It was so rare that doctors would gather around when they saw someone with lung cancer because they thought they'd never see another one with it. Acne is like almost unheard of in countries or in areas like Papua New Guinea and Paraguay, while it affects 3/4 of American teenagers. I think the same is true for Parkinson's disease. That's likely in large part a man-made disease that we brought upon ourselves through industrialization, air pollution, certain pesticides, and industrial chemicals. Many of these chemicals, when we feed them to animals, laboratory animals, they develop the pathological features of Parkinson's disease. Some of the rats even develop a tremor in their paw when they're fed these chemicals. One of my colleagues who sits across the street from me at the University of Rochester 20 years ago demonstrated that feeding a pesticide called Paraquat to mice or rats, I forgot which, results in Parkinson's disease in the animals. So we know in many cases, we know what the likely culprits are for fueling the rise of Parkinson's disease. We just haven't taken sufficient action to address them.
Interesting. And you bring up lung cancer and you bring up cigarettes, which is a pet peeve for mine a little bit, just because I hear all the time, but I didn't smoke cigarettes. And I talk to my clients or people that ask me these questions, you're breathing in chemicals all the time. Even if you're sitting over your sink with a toxic soap that you're cleaning your dishes with, those fumes, you're breathing those into your lungs. And on the side of cigarettes too, I did all this research on cigarettes. The chemicals that are in cigarettes that they put in there that are it's not actually necessarily the tobacco. It could be all these chemicals that are in the cigarettes that they are putting in their nicotine, making things that are making them burn faster. So you want another cigarette quicker. It was crazy to me when I learned all that. I was like, wow, this is, people don't understand that. So I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I did hear that in your book as well. So I love talking about prevention and trying to get people to think about how they can possibly prevent Parkinson's. Do you think there's a realistic time frame, and how could we get there to maybe prevent Parkinson's?
I think Parkinson's is fundamentally a preventable condition. You mentioned inhaling toxins. I think we're doing that for Parkinson's disease. It turns out that the pathology of Parkinson's disease doesn't begin the parts of the brain that control tremor or walking. It's actually the smell centers, and most of these things, air pollution, certain pesticides, industrial chemicals, are all inhaled. The pathology of Parkinson's is found in 95% of people who have Parkinson's is found in the smell centers in the brain, just behind the nose, and then it spreads to other parts of the brain that are responsible for the tremor and slowness of movement that's found in it. These are all eminently preventable. We saw in the setting of COVID that air pollution in many parts of the world, everywhere from Paris to Los Angeles, decreased by about 50% or more. Conversely, we saw with forest fires that the most polluted city in the country last year at one point was actually Denver. Most polluted city in the world last year was Denver, Colorado, at the height of the forest fires. So if we get rid of some of these industrial toxicants, and if we get rid of air pollution, we can see lower rates of Parkinson's. We'll likely see lower rates of Alzheimer's disease, and we can live in a world where we can retain our minds as we hopefully live longer, healthier lives.
It just seems so simple to me, but yeah, it's just taking getting people to understand that it is preventable if you take certain measures.
It's not just someone's got to fight. Listen, right. The HIV activists didn't sit back there and sit in their rooms and wait and let other people take action. And they rose up. They realized that if they didn't bring it, that they were going to die.
Right.
And in 1930s, 40s, and 50s, we had a March of Dimes, which changed the course of polio. And now we live largely in a polio-free world. In the 1980s, a lot of women, I understand many of your listeners are women, I got a little bit sick and tired of their children being maimed and killed in drunk driving accidents. And they formed an organization called MAD, which changed the course of drunk driving. It's socially unacceptable today to drink and drive. My teenage boys, I talk about a lot of things, but I don't need to talk to them about drinking and driving. They think it's like an anthem that people would engage in such behavior. So when people make their voices heard, we change the course of diseases and improve the health, not just for us, but for subsequent generations. And these are all gifts. These are all gifts that we've received, that we haven't asked for, but that we've received from previous generations who stood up, made their voices heard, and changed the course of disease. And so our benefit is that we live in a world that's largely free of polio, and a world where HIV is largely controlled, at least in many parts of the world. And we live in a world where drinking and driving is no longer socially acceptable.
Well, I feel a movement in my world of green living and people doing the exact same thing that I am doing. So one of these days, I feel like we're going to be marching to Washington. I sit in on a lot of different panels and fighting different regulations for New York State to get these chemicals out of the products that our kids are putting in their hair and their face, makeup, which is horrible, not regulated. So I'm with you on that. I'm all about fighting, and we will win. I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. And I love this story about March of Dimes, by the way. I didn't even know where that came from when I read the book. So I appreciate that. So when I am helping people detox their homes, I actually have an air quality monitor. I wish everybody had one because they would start to realize the amount of chemicals that are in their homes. I take these to people's homes and show them the level of formaldehyde, the levels of VOCs that are permeating throughout their homes, and they are absolutely flabbergasted. I'm like, you are breathing these in every day in your home, and then I figure out where they're coming from. But the pandemic, so my question for you on that is, do you think that if people they're spending more time at home, and with the pandemic, they're spraying their houses more with chemicals? I hear this all the time, that they have to get rid of the germs, which of course they're killing good germs too, and they're using so many chemicals to kill these germs. Do you think this could also have an effect on the rate of Parkinson's too?
Yeah, so indoor air pollution is a huge issue, as you alluded to. So among those VOCs, or volatile organic compounds, is a chemical called trichloroethylene. This is what trichloroethylene looks like. It's 2 carbon atoms in black bound to one hydrogen atom in white and 3 chlorine atoms in green. And this chemical, widely used in dry cleaning, used to be decaffeinated coffee in the 1970s. So if you drank Sanka coffee, you were consuming TCE. Widely used in degreasing. So if you're a mechanic or like to clean cars or your bicycle chains, you were likely using this. If you cleaned your carpets, you use this chemical. And if you live near a dry cleaners or an industrial site, many throughout the country, including in upstate New York, you could be breathing in this chemical TCE and not even know it. It forms underground plumes from contaminated sites, and like radon evaporates from the soil and causes lung cancer, TCE evaporates from these underground plumes and increases your risk of Parkinson's by 500% and causes cancer. It's a known carcinogen. It's known to cause liver cancer, kidney cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, prostate cancer, and multiple myeloma. So if you've had any of those diseases and you've worked with, or one of 10 million Americans who's worked with this chemical, or you live near a potentially contaminated site, there are thousands, tens of thousands throughout the United States, including one at 15 minutes from my home, several in the city of Rochester. And this chemical is found in Love Canal in the 1970s, and I'm sure in other sites in Buffalo and where your listeners are. So indoor air pollution is real, and it's readily addressable. Just like you can put a radon mitigation system in your home if you have high levels of radon, you can put in a mitigation system to clean out a TCE by sucking air from underneath your foundation and having it vent above your roof. And some of these chemicals household chemicals, including TCE, can cause different diseases in people's own homes, schools, and workplaces.
I love your chemical, what do you call that? It's not a
structure. It's the model it's the model. It's what your high school kids are learning in chemistry. I took my 10th graders high school chemistry set and made a copy of the chemical myself.
I love it. I might have to get one of those. I think that is such a great.
And it's simple. This thing's been around since the 1920s. Countries in Western Europe have banned it. The United States hasn't. It's still used in spot dry cleaning. It's still used in vapor degreasing. And the toxicity of this chemical has been known since the 1930s. Since, before anyone listening to your podcast, we've known about the health effects of this for 90 years, yet we failed to take action to prevent people from developing cancers and Parkinson's disease due to this chemical.
Very interesting. You mentioned it a lot in the Silicon Valley, that it's very prevalent in Silicon Valley as well, right?
Yeah, so in Silicon Valley, it's used to clean silicon wafers in chip manufacturers. So there's what are they called? A Superfund site. Right. It's the most toxic sites where under the headquarters of Google, due to the contamination by Intel and Fairchild Semiconductor. So many of your listeners worked in the electronics industry, and many of them worked with this chemical. Many of them developed cancer and Parkinson's disease. And not everyone does develop these diseases, but many do, and many people have died because of their work with these chemicals. Just one example, Andy Grove, who used to be the CEO of Intel, developed both prostate cancer and Parkinson's disease in his life. Both those diseases are linked to this chemical. no way to know for sure why he developed those diseases, but it's certainly suspicious.
Yeah, very suspicious for sure. So in the book, you call Parkinson's the scourge of the heartland. And can you explain that?
Yeah, so in addition to industrial chemicals, I've mentioned that pesticides, many of which are nerve toxins, many of which target the energy producing parts of cells that we know are damaged, and substantially increase the risk of Parkinson's disease. The worst offending of these agents is a pesticide called Paraquat, developed in the 1950s. It's considered the most toxic herbicide ever created. It kills the weeds that Roundup doesn't. It's been used to commit homicide and suicide, and it increases the risk of Parkinson's disease by 150%. Over 30 countries, including China, have banned this chemical, but the United States has not. In fact, just last year, the United States reauthorized the use of this chemical, and use of this chemical has increased by 50%. Is that right? 50% over the last 5 years. It's used in farms in Western New York. I visited a vineyard in Western New York that a farmer was using a Paraquat. I'm really unaware of the extent of health effects associated with this chemical. And it's not just farmers who are at increased risk, although they are. And many farmers are the quiet, silent type, so they don't pursue care when it's available to them and when these conditions are treatable. But about up to 40 million Americans get their water not from a municipal or city water, but from private wells. And those private wells aren't regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act. Many of them are in rural areas. Many of them are susceptible to pesticide runoff from nearby farms. So people could have been drinking pesticide contaminated well water when they were a child, when they were a baby, even pregnant mothers, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, or even today, drinking this and having an increased risk of Parkinson's disease years, decades later from this exposure.
And it's still on the market.
It's still on the market. Over 100,000 people, led by the Michael J. Fox Foundation, signed a petition asking it for it to be banned, but it is yet to be banned.
Same with glyphosate, right? I mean, it's just we're trying to get rid of one and now another, and then these two. I mean, it's endless, but
it needs to stop being endless. None of us drive cars from the 1920s, and none of us fly in airplanes from the 1950s. But trichloroethylene was developed in the 1920s, and Paraquat in the 1950s. If engineers can design safer cars and safer airplanes, chemists can come up with safer degreasing and safer pesticides.
For sure. And there are safer methods out there. I do know that because I visited many farms, as you probably know too. It just takes a lot more time and effort. Unfortunately,
it doesn't take a lot more time and effort.
It doesn't.
This is not, listen, no, does it take more time and effort to develop a Honda Accord than it does?
No, you're right. You're right.
No, it can be actually cheaper. It's just that these companies are willfully allowing continuing production of these chemicals. Paraquat is banned in England, but England exports it to Brazil, Mexico, and the United States.
Unbelievable.
Why are we letting England export pesticides to the United States that they've deemed unsafe for their own population? Are Americans' lives worth less than British lives? I just not sure.
It's perplexing. It's perplexing for sure. Now, also when these pesticides, herbicides are being sprayed on all these, on the produce, on the food we eat, we are potentially eating the chemical as well, correct?
Yeah. So, and almost no studies have been done looking at this for Parkinson's disease. As you can imagine, it's hard to randomize people to eat pesticide-laden food versus not pesticide-laden food. And two, you have to wait years for the disease to develop.
Right.
I did ask one of my colleagues who's done a lot of the work in this area, and he said he wouldn't be surprised if people who ate pesticide contaminated food were at increased risk for Parkinson's disease. Even things like wine. I mentioned a vineyard. There was a study of French wines, and they found up to 15 different pesticides found in French wines. And I think in every bottle of wine that essentially the Consumer Reports of France investigated, they found levels of pesticides in them. Even in organic wines, which had lower levels, but still detectable levels of pesticides, likely from contaminated nearby farms.
Oh no, but I only drink organic wine or sustainable or biodynamic. And now I'm like, but I mean, you can do your best, right? We all
Yes,
try our best
exactly.
because you can't avoid everything at all costs. Because again, we walk outside our door. My other question on that matter is I always think about golfers,
Yeah.
and Parkinson's is so much more apparent with men. And I just wonder all the time about I know many people that have developed cancer. I knew somebody that took care of a golf course that died of cancer because of the pesticides, and it changed his DNA. And I just wonder the correlation between golf courses, because we all know the majority of the people that play golf, I mean, a lot of women do, I know that, but mostly men. And I just wonder how much, if there's ever been anything that's been in any study out there with golf courses.
So there was one study reported in the Annals of Neurology that identified 18 people who lived near a golf course and they developed Parkinson's disease. And I think 15 of the 18 lived downwind of the golf course. So again, people inhaling the pesticides that are widely used on golf courses and increasing their risk of Parkinson's disease. There was a pesticide called chlorpyrifos that was just banned by the EPA last year. So one good news. That's been linked to both to Parkinson's disease, to intellectual developmental delay, and to cancer. Worth noting, like individuals like Robin Williams, grew up right next to a golf course and later developed a Parkinson's-related disease called diffuse Lewy body disease. There are enough of these stories, and I've heard a lot of them that they're very concerning, and again, all entirely preventable. I mean, who wants to spend the last 15 to 20 years of their life with a debilitating disease? Yet 1.2 million Americans do or will. And who wants to spend their last 15 to 20 years of their life caring for someone with a debilitating disease? Yet 35 million Americans care for an older adult. And the leading reason people care for an older adult is from brain diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. We can change the course of these diseases. We just need to summon the will to do so.
Yes, absolutely. So the average citizen, anybody, they can do something to help end Parkinson's disease. And also what to do, what do our politicians need to do?
So I'll tell you what they can do right now. You and they can go join a PD Avengers, Parkinson's Disease Avengers, pdavengers.com. It's free to join. Over 4,000 individuals from every state in the country, every province in Canada, and 70 countries around the world have joined. They can also get our book, Ending Parkinson's Disease. If you can't afford a copy of the book, you can email me at info@endingpd.org, and I'll send you a copy for free. Otherwise, you can get one on Amazon, your local bookstore, and all the authors are donating their proceeds to efforts to end Parkinson's disease. Again, the email, if you can't afford the book, just email us, let us know your mailing address. It's info@endingpd.org.
And you also can get it on Audible and all the other online resources where you can listen to it too while you're driving, while you're walking, like I do with my dog. So those are great suggestions. And I love that you're donating. I mean, you put all the time into writing this book and you're donating all the resources, which is just incredible to me.
And we're using some of those resources to investigate clusters of Parkinson's disease here in Rochester that we think are related to the use of that are related to a contaminated dry cleaning site. So the sooner we can identify what are the underlying root causes of disease, whether that's cancer or Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, the sooner we can live in a world that's free of some of these cancers, Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's. I can think of few better gifts a physician or many of us can give than to give a world that is healthier and free of many debilitating diseases to future generations.
Absolutely. I commend you for all that you've done, all that you're doing. Is there anything else that we missed that we should touch on here, or just have everybody read it in the book?
No, I love to hear stories. So if people have stories of either a cluster or that they grew up on a farm or worked with these chemicals, especially trichloroethylene, they can again just email me at info@endingpd.org. Generations before us have changed the course of diseases. What a nice thing would be for our generation to change the course of diseases and give a gift to future generations of a world free of Parkinson's disease. Many of my collaborators, my co-authors, and I are all dedicated to that end, and we love the support of people to do so.
I love that. I will include your email and all your links because you're on Twitter under Ray Dorsey Neuro, and also or 2 Twitter accounts you have, and the website I'll put on there. I love that you give your email address out too. And that's how I reached you, actually. So thank you. And then also on the last note, Jack Quinn, who is a good friend of mine here in Buffalo, and you and I had a little conversation about him. He recently was diagnosed or within the past couple of years with Parkinson's, and came out and told his story to make more people aware of Parkinson's. So Jack was a congressman, and he's really trying to make waves with Parkinson's. So Ray, I've got to link you up with Jack Quinn because you're right down the thruway, and I think the 2 of you need to have a conversation.
That would be great. Now, so it's hard having a disease. It's really hard to be the face of disease. So people like Michael J. Fox, Brian Grant, Alan Alda, David Spinney, and now Congressman Jack Quinn have stepped forward and shared their diagnosis with the public. And when people do that, we should commend them because they're making the lives of millions of other people with the disease easier. They're reducing the stigma associated with the disease, and they're bringing much needed attention to a disease that affects 1.2 million Americans and the world's fastest growing brain disease. The number of Americans with the disease has increased 35% just in the last decade. I'm sure your listeners all have friends and family members who've been affected by the disease. When people like Congressman Jack Quinn and others come forward, it can help change the course of these diseases so that we can all live longer and, perhaps more importantly, healthier lives.
I love it. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I look forward to connecting with you down the road again. And